One of my goals for 2025 was to do more workouts outside because over the past year I've noticed just how much being within the trees helps my mind rest. I've always been the kind of person that can occupy myself with a million different hobbies, but I could never just not do something. So when I'm outside on a hike, I found that it gives me the ability to be doing something because I'm actually physically moving, but at the same time, I can just let my mind wander and think and rest. But the point of me saying all of this is because a couple weeks ago, I picked a new hike to do. And as I went up the mountain, I stopped at every vantage point to look out on the city that I'd grown up in my whole life. And I realized that I was seeing it in this completely new way. As I went up in the morning and evaluated the way the light hit buildings in ways I'd never seen before, I realized that there's always a way to see something in a new way. As I was walking down the mountain, I kept thinking about this and how we can actually apply this lesson to our lives. Often we miss the way the sun falls upon the mountaintops, or the way it brings out the yellow paint on that one building, because we lack the perspective to see it. We spend our whole lives looking up at the trees, but it's quite a different experience looking down on them. If you're stuck with an issue and you don't know where to go, gain new perspective. In 2006, Iver shut the door to his dad's cabin in Wisconsin and wrote the cult classic, For Emma, Forever Ago, an album that when we think back on, we recognize as one of Iver's best works ever. We think back on it and acknowledge it as his first album, and one that was first uploaded onto MySpace, and then has gone on to sell over millions of copies, with songs like Skinny Love and Restacks being covered into oblivion. But what we often forget to recognize is what preceded the album. Before writing the album, Iver, or rather Justin Vernon, had just broke things off with his girlfriend, lost the last of his money due to online poker, and had moved back home after failed success with his band. When he took that trip out to the cabin, the last thing that he was envisioning for his future was that he was going to write the album that would change it all. But I want our focus today to be what that cabin allowed him to do. It allowed him to completely disassociate from responsibility. It allowed him to selfishly indulge into his emotions. And as a result of this, he gained the perspective necessary to write For Emma, Forever Ago. An album that almost certainly would have presented itself differently if he had written it in North Carolina, or if he hadn't recorded every sound on that album himself. And I'm almost certain that it was his ability to tap so truly and deeply into his emotions that has allowed people to connect to it the way that they have. What Justin may or may not have noticed at the time is that he was completely switching his perspective on life and how he experienced it. And he probably really didn't think that locking himself in a cabin was this grand decision. In fact, when asked about it, he even says, I didn't go up there to make a record, but music was just a part of the process for me, ironing out the weird vibe inside of me. I sat down and started working on the songs, layering vocals on top of vocals, trying to be a choir. That's how almost every lyric on the album was written, in that weird subconscious backdoor way. In my opinion, such a central part to the way the album sounds is credit to where he was in the place of recording it, emotionally and physically. Sonically, the whole album has this barren aspect to it, and I mean that in the highest of compliments. Lyrics aside, part of what allowed this album to embody such feelings of emptiness was the way in which he recorded it. Justin was staying in his dad's cabin in the dead of winter in Wisconsin. And we're not talking about a Narnian winter, okay? We're talking about seclusion and a piercing chill in the air. Despite what he brought into the cabin with him, The world around him was lifeless. And what ends up happening is that translates into the way he chooses to record the music. But when it's paired with the rawness of his true feelings, the listener gets this unbearable, realistic portrayal of a man in the depths of his pain. Something that screams so deeply to them that they can't help but listen to it again and again, which was exactly my experience with For Emma Forever Ago. This album for me marks a very specific point in my life. I can still remember the exact picture for the album cover of Birdie's cover of Skinny Love just sitting on my iPod Nano. I recognize Bon Iver as one of the first good musicians that I ever enjoyed. I was lucky enough to grow up listening to bands like U2, but as soon as I got a CD player, most of my life was consumed with Disney Channel stars and all the radio hits. Now, don't get me wrong, I thoroughly enjoyed my time, and to this day, I still enjoy plenty of those old radio songs. But a lot of that music I listened to in middle school, I eventually outgrew, and therefore left behind in my life. And as I got older and discovered albums like Blonde by Frank Ocean, or Because the Internet by Childish Gambino, or For Emma Forever Ago by Bon Iver, it made me realize that I could consume music in a whole new way. So needless to say, this album for me holds very heavy memories, but I believe it in itself plays out like a memory. There is something so all-encompassing about it, as if you're in that cabin with him as well. There's been many times in my life where I've dreamt of locking myself in a cabin and just thinking all day. I'm one of those weirdos who's obsessed with dissecting every emotion and experience to find the value in it, hence this entire podcast. But like, I really mean it. I would definitely be one of those people who voluntarily would lock themselves in those South Korean jails where they give you nothing but food, a journal, and a pen, and you have no concept of time or reality, so you're just left to your own thoughts. Like, I would actively choose to do this, and I even tried to DIY it, in a sense, one time. I went on a camping trip with my cousin, and I had brought my journal, and every time I had a chance alone, I would take my journal out and put my phone away, with the hopes to write this transformative journal entry. I craved so deeply to dawn upon some life-changing philosophy, but it never happened. And I remember struggling so much with the unsatisfying feeling of never getting what I wanted to feel. But what my hike this past week taught me is that sometimes it's not that serious. Sometimes you don't need to lock yourself in a cabin or go on a camping trip. Sometimes you just need to climb up a couple steps of a mountain. Sometimes you just need to drive 40 minutes away from your city to a new one you've never been to. Sometimes you just need to apologize to someone. Sometimes, now get this, sometimes, and even more often than you might think, you just need to dance around your room listening to music. The value of a new perspective is unmatched. In the process of writing today's episode, I found such a good podcast that did a whole episode dissecting For Emma Forever Ago. In the episode, the host goes through 40 minutes of dissecting every song and every lyric. And I just couldn't recommend listening to it anymore, so of course it's going to be linked in the show notes. But the podcast is called The Sound and the Story. And something that the host points out in it is how Justin ends the whole EP with the song Restacks, and how he sings the words, "This is not the sound of a new man or a crispy realization. It's the sound of unlocking and the lift away. Your love will be safe with me." Pointing out to the listener that though he was able to express his feelings, to put a name to them, and to write music once again, it doesn't mean that he's left those feelings behind in the cabin too, but rather that they will always be a part of the way he processes life. And I think that this is a very important note to make. Often I can push so much towards the half glass full aspect of life that I forget the humanity of it. The truth is, there's so many lessons I've learned or lessons I've watched other people learn that will never truly leave my memory. There are just some moments that hold so much value that they become a part of the way we identify and the way we live in the world. So just because I say perspective is all this and it's all that, it doesn't necessarily mean it promises a solution. I haven't lived enough life to die on this hill, but I would tend to believe that most of the situations we go through can be solved by perspective, specifically the portion of pain that we experience that is self-inflicted, like the negative beliefs we have about ourselves and the world. Feelings like these are in our control because they come down to the way that we choose to see life. Reframing pain might be the hardest yet most rewarding experience. Before I end today, I want to share 2 poems written by Mary Oliver. Mary Oliver is a brilliant writer who often reminds me to rest in the design of the world. And she is a woman who can write about perspective in a way that I never could, so I want to share today. The first poem is When I Am Among the Trees. When I am among the trees, especially the willows and the honey locust, equally the beech, the oaks and the pines, they give off such hints of gladness. I would almost say that they save me, and daily. I am so distant from the hope of myself, in which I have goodness and discernment, and never hurry through the world but walk slowly and bow often. Around me the trees stir in their leaves and call out, "Stay a while." The light flows from their branches, and they call again. It's simple, they say. And you too have come into the world to do this. To go easy, to be filled with light, and to shine. And the second poem is The Gardener. Have I lived enough? Have I loved enough? Have I considered right action enough? Have I come to any conclusion? Have I experienced happiness with sufficient gratitude? Have I endured loneliness with grace? I say this, or perhaps I'm just thinking it. Actually, I probably think too much. Then I step out into the garden, where the gardener, who is said to be a simple man, is tending his children, the roses. Finally, to close, I'm reminded of the hike that I was telling you about earlier. As I looked out on the trees and the way that the sun made them shine in ways I'd never seen before, I think back on when Mary wrote, "The light flows from their branches, and they call again. It's simple, they say. And you too have come into the world to do this, to go easy, to be filled with light, and to shine." The host of the Sound and Story podcast also noted that there's 2 ways to look at the album cover of For Emma Forever Ago. One in which the frost is slowly overtaking the window, or the other, that it is slowly defrosting off of the window. This then points back to what we've been talking about this whole episode, perspective. The choice in life you will always have is which way to look at it. Let's let music bring us together, and don't forget to grow up slowly.